a rose that should have withered only once. Yet it returned. Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Vela. Don't share where you're listening from. I love seeing this community grow. Your voices make each case unforgettable. Let's dive in. It was in the damp, unseasonably chill of an April morning that an affair reached Baker Street which, for sheer perversity of circumstance, would have disheartened any policeman less obstinate than Inspector Lestrade. I had risen earlier than was my habit and was standing with my back to the fire, watching the fog press its grey face against the window panes like a curious child, when our landlady announced an early caller. Holmes, who had been awake through the small hours with his violin and a monograph on the volatile oils of certain Himalayan shrubs, merely lifted an eyebrow and stretched his long legs towards the fender. Our visitor entered in a rustle of silk and an exhalation of some light floral perfume that, oddly enough, turned my mind to greenhouses and damp loam. She was a handsome woman of middle years, dressed with that sober richness which speaks of old money and recent anxiety. A gauzy veil failed to disguise eyes that had been deprived of sleep and grown impatient with consolation. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she began, sinking into the chair I offered, "I am Lady Eugenia Vale. You may know my late husband's name, Sir Septimus Vale." Holmes inclined his head as if permitting his memory to perform a courtesy it already intended. The philanthropist and industrial chemist, hospitals, reform societies, and a noted conservatory at his townhouse in Cheyne Walk. "Pray continue, Lady Eugenia." "It is not his charities that bring me," she said, and twisted the fingers of one glove. "It is his death, if death it is, for though the law calls it natural, there is nothing natural in the manner of it. And then there is the rose." Holmes turned his face fully to her. His eyes, which could seem languid at rest, took on in a breath the hard clarity of a magnifying lens. "The rose?" he repeated softly. "The rose that died twice," she said, and the phrase, absurd in the mouth of ordinary grief, sounded in hers like a pronouncement. "Forgive me, I am overwrought." Holmes's thin hand steepled. "You have said enough to secure my interest. Now say enough to secure my understanding." She told us, with a self-control that did her credit, that Sir Septimus had returned the previous evening from a meeting of the Royal Horticultural Society. He had retired, as was his habit, to the conservatory that crowned the back of their house, an elegant structure of iron and glass overlooking the Thames. Servants had orders never to intrude upon him there. He would potter among his specimens, note in a ledger the progress of an orchid or rose, and smoke a single cigar. At 11, when he did not come to the drawing-room as he usually did, Lady Eugenia sent the butler, Dean, who found the conservatory door locked on the inside. Receiving no answer to his knock, Dean fetched a gardener's ladder, mounted, and peered through the high panes. Sir Septimus was in his wicker chair, Lady Eugenia said, and her voice sank. His head tilted, his hand upon a book. One might have thought him dozing, save for the colour of his lips. We both know that colour, Holmes and I. For all that physicians may dress death in Latin, the thing itself is not genteel. The gardener forced a side panel, she continued. They carried him to his bed. The doctor, Dr. Braithwaite, whom we have trusted for years, declared his heart had failed. Sir Septimus had in his buttonhole a white rose. It was a curiosity he treasured, a sport from an old climbing variety he had brought back from the continent and propagated under glass. When I saw him, her gloved hand touched the veil at her throat. When I saw him, the rose was fresh, new cut. It had a drop of moisture at one petal's edge. Holmes had not moved, but I observed the smallest tightening at the corners of his mouth. "And then," he said, Dr. Braithwaite removed the flower and placed it on the table by the bed. He left me, and I sat with my husband for, an hour, perhaps. When I looked at it again, the rose was withered as if it had lain in the sun a week. Its petals had browned at the tips, and the calyx was shrunk and dark. I thought it my fancy until Dean exclaimed upon it. "My lady," he said, "the master's rose is dead again." He meant it for comfort, that even his favourite bloom grieved him. But I tell you, Mr. Holmes, it was not grief. It was wrong. In the morning, Inspector Lestrade came to make his inquiries, and when he saw it, he too grew uneasy. He told me to come to you at once. As if summoned by the memory of his name, Lestrade himself appeared at our door without ceremony, a damp bowler under his arm, and a fixed expression that I had learned to associate with the presence of something that would not square with his ledger. There was a civil exchange, and then the practical facts marched out of him in parade order. "Locked room of sorts," said Lestrade, warming his small hands at the blaze. "Conservatory door bolted on the inside, side panel screwed from within, smashed to get in. No signs of struggle, no marks upon the body to speak of, unless you count a faint dusting of something like soot upon the right wrist. Doctor says the heart gave out. He had one of his cigars half consumed in the tray, and the ash is clean. No sign it fell in a rush. There's a book open by his side, some gardening thing, and a ledger with dates and numbers none of us can make heads nor tails of. That's about the size of it." "And the rose," Holmes murmured. Lestrade pulled a face. "Well, Dr. Watson, I'm a reasonable man. Flowers wilt. But I'll allow this one's conduct is peculiar. It's as the lady says. The thing looked like a bride's ornament at midnight, and like a churchyard relic at dawn. I don't say there's a crime in a flower's fancy, but I don't say there isn't one either. Not with Sir Septimus Vale." Holmes rose, and the languor fell from him like a discarded cloak. He went to the mantel, lifted the little Persian slipper in which he kept his tobacco, and set it down again untouched. His nostrils had flared very slightly when Lady Eugenia first entered. Now, without looking at her directly, he said, "You have passed, since you left your house, along the embankment and through a lane where a gas-fitter's lad had been at work within the last hour. Your carriage bears on its left step a smudge of lamp-black, and your veil, pray do not be alarmed, carries a hint of phenol. You wore it in a room where carbolic had lately been used." Lady Eugenia started. "Yes, Dr. Braithwaite cleaned his instruments there afterwards. But how could you—" "Elementary," said Holmes, with that air of bored courtesy which he uses to spare people the mortification of their own surprise. "London writes upon all who walk her." He began to pace. "A man of method does not die a theatrical death. Yet we are presented with a melodrama, a locked conservatory, a flower that plays ghost, a dusting of soot upon the wrist of an industrial chemist who kept precise ledgers and smoked only one cigar of an evening. I confess the stage is set too well for my taste." Lestrade emitted his little snort. "You'll say it's murder in a sealed glass box, and the murderer crawled up the flue like a sweep." Holmes smiled without mirth. "You wrong yourself, Lestrade. You are not so imaginative." "And you," said Lestrade, bristling, "are too much so by half. Still, if you mean to look, Mr. Holmes, I'll not stand in your way. The doctor's satisfied, but the Yard is not convinced by a rose that goes off like milk. There's the matter of Sir Septimus's papers too. His secretary says nothing is missing, but secretaries don't always know what is worth stealing. Ah, said Holmes, and stopped. "There is a secretary." "Amos Brack," Lestrade replied. "A careful little man with a careful little beard. Been with Sir Septimus 5 years. Knows his dates and figures, and says his master had enemies, though he won't be drawn on names. There's also a cousin, Mr. Lionel Vale, who had expectations that didn't come up to the mark, and a rival in horticulture, a certain Mr. Willoughby of Kew, who is hot for orchids and cool for Sir Septimus. The servants are as steady as house bricks." Holmes turned to Lady Eugenia. "Madam, you have given me cause to visit your house without delay. If it suits, we shall be with you within the hour." She stood. The relief in her eyes was nearly painful to witness. "I am grateful, Mr. Holmes. If there is villainy here, I beg you to root it out, quietly, if possible. My husband loved his good name as he loved his plants." When the door had closed behind them, Holmes crossed to the window and drew a finger along the glass, leaving a clear trail through the beaded fog. He examined the moisture upon his fingertip as if it were a specimen, and gave one of those short laughs that are less mirth than recognition. "Then, Watson," he said, "there are 3 smells in this room that were not here when we retired at 2. A watery floral with a green back note, a trace of lampblack, and the unmistakable ghost of carbolic acid. Each of our visitors carried his or her own weather." He took his hat from the peg. "A flower that dies twice is a poor botanist's paradox, but it is excellent chemistry. We shall go to Cheyne Walk." "And you believe—" "I believe nothing," he cut in, his eyes bright. "I observe that a man who made his fortune mastering the behaviour of substances has departed this world in the company of a substance that has behaved oddly. Let us see whether the rose faded or was made to fade." Cheyne Walk met us with a damp wind off the river, and a dull glitter upon the glass crown that marked the Vale Conservatory. The house itself was a sober, well-bred structure whose brick had the colour of old port. The servants admitted us with that quiet alacrity which means the master is dead, and authority has flown into many hands at once. Lady Eugenia received us in a room that smelled faintly of lavender and the coal fire. She had mastered herself, but her eyes went, as a needle to a lodestone, toward the back windows, where the iron ribs of the conservatory traced a geometry against the grey. "Dean will take you at once, Mr. Holmes," she said. "Inspector Lestrade is in the library with Mr. Brack." Holmes bowed and asked for the conservatory first. I confess my own curiosity hastened my step. As we followed the butler down a corridor of black and white tile to a door of oak, whose lower panels were scarred by a recent violence, Dean, a tall, careful man with a naturally respectful manner, showed us the splintered catch and the inside bolt lying snapped upon the sill. "We went by the side panel there," he said, indicating a narrow iron-framed casement, whose screws, now twisted, lay in a small china dish. "Mr. Holmes, it is grievous to me to have broken the master's house, but we thought only of getting to him." Holmes was already elsewhere in his attention. He stepped past us into the conservatory and stood very still. The place was a paradise of ordered verdure. Benches of orchids with their obscene, beautiful mouths agape, ranks of roses, canes trained and labelled, a tall palm making a shadow like a hand upon the glass. The Thames showed in a ribbon between fog and frame. A wicker chair sat near a small iron table. Upon the latter, a cut-glass ashtray held the butt of a dark cigar, and next to it lay a thin octavo book, Ludlow's Roses Under Glass, face down with a sprig of dried fern marking a chapter. A ledger, tied with green tape, waited with a dip pen across it. In the gravel at the foot of the chair, a darker patch suggested spilt water. Beside it, upon a low bench, stood a shallow tin pan, as if recently cleaned. Holmes took in these things as a single picture. He drew from his pocket lens and bent not to the grand features but to the trifles. He examined the bolt's broken tongue, the screw holes of the side panel, the ashtray's rim, the inner edge of the door, where the paint showed a minute set of vertical scratches. "Watson," he said softly, "note the scratches. A thin blade worked between wood and iron here more than once. Not last night. Older. See the varnish dulled where a hand naturally rests to draw the bolt." He moved to the chair and lifted the book without disturbing the fern. Dust beneath the book, but not upon its upper board. It was set down last night or early this morning. The page it marked is on pruning wounds and the prevention of rot. He set it aside and touched the cigar ash with a penknife. A fresh Havana, no humectant, you observe. Clean white ash, unbroken cone. Our man sat without agitation. He turned his lens upon the tin pan. A faint bloom of grey clung to its lip like breath upon a mirror. Holmes touched it with a finger, lifted it and sniffed so lightly that the action would have escaped anyone not used to his ways. "Soot," he murmured, "not from a chimney, from a smouldering composition. Dean, what is this pan used for?" "The fumigation, sir," said the butler. The master burned brimstone at times to rid the green fly. He would put a little sulphur in the pan, light it with a slip of paper, and let the vapours sit. Holmes's eyes brightened, but his face remained impassive. "And when last was it used?" "3 nights ago," Dean replied. "The master himself attended to it. He would not permit the under-gardeners to meddle." Holmes nodded and turned his lens to the wicker chair's right arm. A smear, hardly more than a shadow, stained the wickerwork there. He scraped at it with a thumbnail, producing a tiny coal-black crescent that left his finger marked. "Soot upon the wrist, soot upon the chair," he said. "Consistent at least." The rosebeds under glass drew him next. He passed slowly down the ranks until he stopped before a small bowl, in which lay the withered remains of a white bloom. Even in death, it showed a curious regularity of form. The petals curled inwards, their edges browned, the calyx shrunken and hard as if parched by a hot wind. One petal bore a translucent tide mark like a crescent of dried tear. "This is the flower?" Holmes asked. Dean inclined his head. "The very one, sir. I placed it there when the doctor removed it. It was fair as snow at midnight. By dawn I scarce recognized it." Holmes lifted the bowl to the light, his nostrils signalling before his tongue did. "There is a ghost of something upon it, not perfume. A mineral tang, no. A burning that is not heat." He looked about and found, near the ledger, a little packet tied with string. He untied it and disclosed a few brownish-yellow cakes like misshapen coins. "Flowers of sulphur," he said, and put the packet down with a delicacy I have seen him apply to a loaded pistol, common enough to a gardener with scientific pretensions. We left the conservatory for the library, where Lestrade rose from a chair, his notebook on his knee, and a small man with a pointed beard unfolded himself like a penknife and bowed twice. Amos Brack's careful pallor and neatly brushed coat gave the impression of a ledger translated into flesh. "You managed Sir Septimus's papers," Holmes said without introduction. "For 5 years, Mr. Holmes," replied the secretary, his voice precise and almost toneless. "His correspondence, his patents, his charitable accounts, and his botanical notes." "His charitable accounts," repeated Holmes, as if tasting the phrase. "Any recent friction? Litigations? Threats?" Brack's eyes moved to Lestrade and back. Sir Septimus was a generous man, but not a fool. He had declined only last week to fund a certain laboratory in Chelsea. The petitioner, Mr. Lionel Vale, was disappointed. "The cousin," I said. "A near relation," Brack amended. "He believes himself a genius. He is a spendthrift." Sir Septimus thought both conditions curable by exertion. "And Mr. Willoughby of Kew?" Holmes asked. Brack's thin lips pressed together. "A rival in horticultural honours and in nothing else." There was a question of a prize rose. Sir Septimus had propagated a sport he named Alba Valensis. Mr. Willoughby maintained it was an old French variety masquerading under a new name. Sharp words in the Society Journal, and some gentlemanly chill thereafter. Holmes allowed himself a fractional shrug. Gentlemanly chill rarely kills. "Where is Mr. Lionel Vale?" Lestrade answered. "In town since last night. Lodgings off Sloane Square. I've sent a man." Holmes had already reached for the green-taped ledger. He untied it, spread it upon the desk, and traced the columns with a forefinger. Dates ran down the left, precise to the hour. Opposite them, abbreviations cryptic to me. SO2 2S, Vent E closed, RH 5568, AV saw 3 budded. He paused upon the last entries. "Here," he said, and moved aside so I could read. 8:37, sulphur pan lit 1 dram. 8:45, vent east closed. 9:10, rose buttonhole taken from AV letter 3. Moisture good. 10:05, cigar. Will 10:40, note on pruning LM. The remaining lines wandered abruptly, as if the hand had gone uncertain. Holmes shut the book, as a man closes a door upon a draught. "You see, Lestrade, our dead man was method to the marrow. He recorded the lighting of sulphur and the closing of a vent. He cut his own flower and set it in his buttonhole at 9:10. He touched his cigar later. There is no hurry, no break in habit, until there is silence." "Then the heart," said Lestrade, though without zeal, Perhaps, Holmes returned, or perhaps something that persuades a heart to be still without leaving gross violence behind. He tapped the ledger lightly. "Sulphur burns to a gas that is not kind to living tissue. In a closed glass room it plays many tricks. Upon insects, upon petals, upon lungs, particularly when the air is made still." Lady Eugenia's step in the passage forestalled Brack's intended word. She appeared at the library threshold, pale but composed. "Mr. Holmes, you asked for Dr. Braithwaite's case-book. He has sent it by his boy." Holmes accepted the small, worn volume, turned a few pages, and closed it again. "Thank you, Lady Eugenia. I shall require one thing more. The key to the conservatory, and your leave to revisit the room at twilight. There are certain behaviours of vapours that prefer the evening." She looked at him with a mixture of hope and dread. "You believe my husband was—" "I believe your husband made a careful note, and that someone else relied upon his care," Holmes said, with a gentleness that did not soften his meaning. "We will not borrow trouble. Let us ask the room to tell us what it told him, and listen more closely." Holmes had taken the case-book with him into the dimmer corner of the library, and was turning its leaves as if their paper whispered some secret language. The doctor's neat hand had recorded without flourish the details of Sir Septimus's decline. Pulse absent, respiration ceased, lividity about the lips. It was all precise, professional, and curiously devoid of inquiry. Holmes snapped the book shut, and slipped it into his pocket with the remark that such neatness often hid more than it revealed. Lady Eugenia did not protest. She seemed willing to let him carry off anything that might draw light into the shadows that haunted her house. Lestrade had stationed himself near the fireplace, where Brack stood stiff as a figure in a wax museum. Holmes approached them with an abruptness that made the secretary start. "Mr. Brack, you said your master refused Lionel Vale funds for a laboratory. What was the nature of his research? Brack hesitated, eyes narrowing. Electrical applications to botany, sir. He has the notion that shocks may stimulate growth. Sir Septimus dismissed it as childish folly. Holmes's gaze flicked to Lestrade. You will want to confirm whether the cousin's disappointment carried him as far as Cheyne Walk last night. But before you expend your men upon errands, permit me to speak with Dr. Braithwaite in person. A boy's errand book may omit what a man's conscience cannot. Lady Eugenia arranged for the doctor to call within the hour, and Holmes used the interlude to revisit the conservatory. I trailed him, notebook ready, though I could not hope to see what his eye caught. He paused at the pan again, then at the vent lever which hung from a chain. He tugged it gently, noted the angle, and then stooped to examine the floor under the chair. He drew from the gravel a minute scrap of charred paper, crumbling, no larger than a shilling. He wrapped it carefully in an envelope. Watson, do you perceive what this is? It appears no more than burnt paper. Exactly, and therefore something more. Brimstone may be lit by a scrap, but this, I think, was no mere gardener's taper. We shall examine it under proper light. For now, it tells me that Sir Septimus was not alone in tending his fumigations. Before I could press him, Dean's voice announced the arrival of Dr. Braithwaite. He was a portly, ruddy man, whose presence conveyed the robust air of a provincial physician transplanted to town. He gave us a cordial bow, but his glance darted uneasily toward Lady Eugenia. Holmes spared her the ordeal and drew the doctor into the small study adjoining. Doctor, he said with a softness that concealed the iron beneath, you certified death from heart failure. Upon what grounds? The man was elderly, though not infirm, Braithwaite replied, moistening his lips. He was found in his chair, pulse extinguished, no outward violence. The heart, Mr. Holmes, is the ultimate arbiter. It ceases, so too the man. True enough. Yet you noted soot upon his wrist, a trifle. He had handled the pan, no doubt. Holmes's eyes fixed upon him, and the rose. At this the doctor shifted his weight. I remarked its sudden decay, yes, but flowers are delicate. Vapours will do strange things. The lady's grief magnified it. My task is with men, not blooms. Holmes let the silence lengthen until the man tugged at his collar. Then Holmes leaned forward. You perceived no odour in the room when you entered? Odour? Why, yes, a faint acridity. Sulphur, I presumed. Holmes straightened, satisfied. Sulphur, indeed. That will do, Doctor. You may be called upon again. When Braithwaite had gone, Lestrade frowned. You draw much from very little, Mr. Holmes. The doctor sees a natural death, as would any man of sense. Any man of sense, Lestrade, but not necessarily of science. Consider. Sir Septimus was in full health, methodical, engaged in his nightly pursuits. He lights sulphur at 8:37, closes a vent, cuts a rose, smokes a cigar. By 10:40 he is dead. His notes record no distress, no dizziness, no faltering hand. What intervened between 9 and 10? Watson, myself, ventured a guess. The vapour from the pan? But he had employed it for years. Just so. Holmes replied. Sulphur alone he could withstand. But suppose another element were introduced, an impurity, a compound volatile at low flame. Suppose our chemist, so precise, inhaled what he had not prepared. The flower, more delicate than a man, showed its effects first. By morning it was a corpse itself. The thought chilled me, but Lestrade remained stubborn. And who would contrive such a thing? His wife, his secretary? This cousin you mention? That is what we shall learn. Meanwhile, we require a second crime, or at least a second clue, before the pattern stands complete. Holmes turned toward Lady Eugenia, who hovered like a figure on a threshold between dread and hope. Madam, may I trouble you for a list of all who had access to the conservatory keys in the past fortnight? She promised to provide it at once, and Holmes, with a briskness that signalled his mind was already elsewhere, declared that we must return at dusk. He wished to observe the conservatory under lamplight, when vapours behaved with more mischief. As we prepared to depart, Lestrade caught my arm. "He makes riddles out of roses, Doctor. But mark me, there'll be a plain culprit in this before long, and no talk of vapours will change it." Holmes, overhearing, smiled thinly. "Plain culprits, Lestrade, often choose the most decorative masks. Let us see which mask falls first." And with that he swept from the house, the fog swallowing us again, as if the veiled tragedy were not enough to stir the very air of London. The evening fog clung to the river like a damp shroud when we returned to Cheyne Walk. Lamps glowed dimly behind drawn curtains, and the conservatory's iron frame loomed against the murk like the ribs of some leviathan beached upon the Thames. Lady Eugenia herself admitted us, the lines of fatigue more deeply etched upon her features. Holmes requested that no lamps be lit in the conservatory until he gave word, and she complied with a composure that suggested she had surrendered her house wholly to his governance. Lestrade arrived not long after, stamping his feet irritably against the chill, his manner testy from a day spent chasing Lionel Vale's movements. Holmes wasted no time. "Watson, your lantern, if you please." I struck a light, and together we stepped into the conservatory. The evening pressed at the glass. Within, the smell of earth and fading blossoms mingled with a sharper tang I could not immediately name. Holmes moved to the vent chain, tugged it half closed, then set the tin pan upon the floor with exaggerated care. He tapped its rim with his fingernail, and the faint, dry rattle echoed among the orchids. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly, "how the air settles once the vents are closed. Already your breath gathers on the glass. Imagine what lingers here if a substance is released." He crouched and held his lens near the gravel, inspecting each grain as if it concealed a cipher. Then he straightened abruptly, sniffed the air, and gestured for silence. A faint draught crept through the cracks of the side panel, the one earlier forced open. Holmes knelt by it, touched the frame with a fingertip, and drew back with a satisfied nod. "As I thought. Resin applied here recently to seal a leak. But note, only 3 of the 4 corners bear the varnish. Whoever tampered with the panel meant to preserve the illusion of a hermetically closed chamber while allowing the faintest trickle of air to escape. Why? To bleed off what might otherwise kill too swiftly." Lestrade grunted. "You'll have us believe the fellow was murdered by his own flower pots. I'd sooner put my shilling on the cousin. I've men who swear Lionel Vale returned to his lodgings before midnight, but he could have slipped away again." Holmes ignored the remark. He had moved to the bench where the shriveled rose still lay. He touched one petal gently, then turned to Lady Eugenia, who had entered with hesitant steps. "Madam, did your husband ever permit others to tend this rose, the Alba Valensis?" She shook her head. "Never. He guarded it as one might a child. Amos Brack watered it when Sir Septimus was abroad, but never cut a bloom." Holmes inclined his head. "That accords with what I suspected." He took up the ledger once more and opened to the final page. The lines, written with mechanical neatness until the hour of 10, faltered thereafter, a jagged stroke across the margin. Holmes traced it with a forefinger. This is the moment his faculties gave way. Yet note, he still attempted to write. The hand is not paralyzed, merely failing from want of air. He replaced the ledger, then walked the length of the conservatory, pausing before each specimen with the deliberation of a surgeon examining organs. At last he stopped at a small shelf in the corner, upon which stood several glass phials. He uncorked one and sniffed delicately. His lips curved in a smile that was nearer to satisfaction than amusement. "Arsenical solution for pests," he murmured. "But not this. Here." He selected another phial, half full of a clear liquid. "Chloroform? For rooting experiments, no doubt. A man may anaesthetize seeds as well as men. Curious that it should stand uncorked." Lady Eugenia gasped. "Uncorked? But I saw him seal it myself last week." Holmes closed the bottle firmly and placed it aside. "Watson, you will remember this odour in a ward. Sweet, heavy, unmistakable. If vapours of sulphur filled the room and were adulterated with a measure of this, what then? The bloom would brown, the lungs would falter, and death would come without violence." The open vent explains why the dose did not overwhelm him instantly. He sat, puzzled perhaps by a dizziness, and the ledger slipped from his control. Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "You mean someone slipped the stuff into his fumigation pan?" Holmes tapped the charred scrap he had pocketed earlier. "I believe this fragment will tell us so when examined. It is all too neat. Sulphur, chloroform, a closed chamber, and a ledger to record the fatal minute. The hand that arranged it was versed in chemistry enough to be bold, yet careless enough to leave traces." His glance shifted toward Brack, who hovered in the doorway like a wary bird. "Mr. Secretary, did you often handle such substances?" Brack's voice was quick, too quick. "Only under Sir Septimus's instruction. I am no chemist, Mr. Holmes." "Yet you know enough to maintain his notes?" Holmes asked mildly. "That ledger was meant for your eye as well as his." The secretary flushed, but Lady Eugenia interposed, her voice trembling. "Mr. Holmes, you do not accuse him." Holmes bowed slightly. "I accuse no one until the pieces fit without force. But the pieces are gathering, and some fit better than others." The lamps were lit then, casting long shadows among the roses. Holmes surveyed the room once more, then gave his hat a sharp adjustment. "Our work here is not finished. Lestrade, hold your men ready. There is one who profited most from Sir Septimus's silence, and it is he I intend to draw into the open. I have a notion to bait a hook with a rose that has died once already. Let us see whether it will tempt the hand that made it die again." With that enigmatic declaration, he led us back into the misty night, the smell of sulphur and withered petals lingering in my nostrils, as though the conservatory itself had breathed upon me. I could not tell whether I had left a garden of science or a chamber of death. Holmes, however, walked swiftly, his mind alight, as though the case had at last begun to bloom in his imagination. The fog lay thicker still when we reached Baker Street, wrapping the lamps in aureoles of orange, and muting the clatter of hooves to a muffled rhythm. Holmes wasted no time in removing his overcoat, setting the charred scrap he had carried from Cheyne Walk upon a porcelain dish, and drawing his chemical cabinet near. I, weary from the damp night air, dropped into my chair, yet curiosity compelled me to watch. With the delicate precision of a watchmaker, Holmes subjected the fragment to reagents, each fizz and faint smoke speaking to him in a language I could only dimly follow. "There," he said at last, holding up a slip of filter paper stained a faint yellow-brown. "Chlorinated hydrocarbons, Watson. Crude but undeniable. This was no gardener's taper. Whoever prepared the pan mixed sulphur with a trace of chloroform or some analogous substance concealed in a twist of paper. When lit, it gave off vapours that did not merely suffocate insects. Our chemist was murdered by his own science, turned against him." I leaned forward. "But who among them would possess both the knowledge and the daring? Surely not Lady Eugenia. Her grief is genuine. Brack is cautious to the point of timidity. Lestrade swears by Lionel Vale's resentment. But resentment alone does not furnish chemical skill." Holmes smiled faintly. "Your instincts serve you well, Watson. Each name you dismiss is a signpost. Let us not gallop. First we shall see how the bait swims." He took from the mantel the shriveled rose and placed it in a small glass dome. This, combined with the whisper that Sir Septimus may have discovered the hand that tampered with his fumigations, will suffice to stir the guilty party. Tomorrow we shall give opportunity for agitation and observe who grasps at it. I asked what form this trap might take, but Holmes merely lit his pipe and allowed the smoke to curl upward like a signal to the ceiling. His silence meant the plan was already formed, and I had learned better than to press him prematurely. Morning brought a pale sun that did little to dispel the damp. Over breakfast, Holmes received a note, delivered by hand. He scanned it quickly and passed it to me. It bore Lestrade's blunt script. "Lionel Vale denies knowledge of chemistry, but admits calling upon Sir Septimus the afternoon of his death. Quarrel reported by servants. Strong motive. Shall I arrest?" Holmes chuckled. "The Yard is never happier than when a quarrel stands ready-made. Yet premature arrest would close the jaws before the fish is in the net. No, we shall let Lionel swim free a little longer. Tell Lestrade to bring both cousin and secretary to Cheyne Walk this evening. The house will host them whether they wish it or not." That evening we returned once more to Lady Eugenia's drawing-room. The lady herself looked worn but resolute, and when Holmes explained that he required the presence of Lionel Vale and Amos Brack under her roof, she consented with a fortitude that surprised me. "If it clears my husband's name from the suspicion of natural decay," she said, "I shall endure it." Lionel Vale arrived first, a man of striking appearance, with a mane of dark hair and eyes too restless to remain long upon any object. He greeted his cousin's widow with a mixture of courtesy and defiance, bowing low but straightening, as if daring her to resent him. "You would not have sent for me, madam, had not others compelled you," he said. "I hope Mr. Holmes will explain this intrusion upon my liberty." Holmes merely inclined his head, then turned his attention to Brack, who entered next with the quiet of a shadow. The secretary's narrow frame and precise movements contrasted starkly with Lionel's volatility. Where the cousin vibrated with nervous energy, Brack seemed to drain the room of it. Holmes placed the glass dome with the shriveled rose upon the table between them. Both men glanced at it, but in different manners. Lionel with an uncomprehending sneer, Brack with a tightening about the lips so slight I might have missed it had I not watched closely. Holmes spoke then, his tone light, conversational. "This rose," he said, "died twice, once by nature, once by artifice. Sir Septimus noted its perfection at 9:10. By midnight it was withered as though a week had passed. What agency do you suppose could contrive such decay?" Lionel gave a scoff. "Some gardener's trick. I've no patience with flowers." Brack's voice, however, was measured. "A fumigation may burn too hot. The petals scorch. The tissue perishes. Sir Septimus himself warned me so." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Ah, you admit you were instructed in such matters?" The secretary's composure faltered for the breadth of a heartbeat. "Only in routine, sir. I fetched the sulphur when asked. Nothing more. Nothing more." Holmes allowed silence to grow until Lionel, impatient, broke it with a laugh. "If you look for culprits in this, search elsewhere. I may have quarrelled with my cousin over money, but I am no poisoner. I left him alive and hearty. Had I wished his death, I'd have chosen a simpler method." Holmes leaned back, his fingers steepled. Simpler, yes, yet the true culprit chose a method subtle, silent and theatrical. He counted on the doctor to record heart failure, on the widow to mourn, and on the Yard to seize upon family resentment. But he forgot one thing, that the rose would speak more eloquently than any witness. Brack shifted in his chair. Lionel flushed crimson. Lady Eugenia's eyes darted between them, bewildered and afraid. Lestrade, hovering by the mantel, muttered that Holmes had better come to the point. Holmes rose. The point, my dear Lestrade, is best made when the quarry betrays himself. I shall return to this house tomorrow evening. At the same hour Sir Septimus met his fate. If either of these gentlemen cares to clear his name, let him join us, for in that conservatory I intend to reproduce every circumstance of that fatal night, save only the fatal outcome. At that, Brack sprang to his feet, his composure cracked. You cannot, you must not! Such an experiment would endanger. He stopped short, realizing too late that his vehemence had betrayed him. Holmes's eyes glittered. Ah, endanger whom, Mr. Brack? The guilty alone. With that, he replaced the dome over the rose and closed the matter for the night. But I saw enough in the twitch of Brack's fingers and the pallor of his cheek to know that Holmes's hook had indeed found purchase in troubled waters. The next night's experiment would drag something hidden into the light. The following evening was one of oppressive stillness, the fog having thickened into a woolen blanket that muffled every sound along the river. Lamps shone dimly through it like drowned stars. And even the clop of horses' hoofs upon the cobbles reached us at Cheyne Walk with a strange, distant quality. Lady Eugenia received us in silence, her face pale but resolute. She had dismissed the servants for the night, save for Dean, who lingered in the background like a sentinel. Holmes had insisted on privacy. He wanted no whispers of what was about to occur until the matter was concluded. Lestrade arrived with the air of a man half convinced he was walking into folly, and half hoping to see Holmes confounded. Lionel Vale came shortly after, sullen but defiant, his gaze flashing with irritation whenever it strayed towards the conservatory doors. Brack entered last, as immaculate as ever, but I thought I caught a sheen of moisture on his brow, despite the chill. Holmes greeted each with the same courteous neutrality, then gestured towards the conservatory. "Gentlemen," he said, "you are about to witness the reconstruction of Sir Septimus's final hour. I've restored the chamber precisely as he left it. The vents adjusted, the pan upon the floor, even the ledger upon the table. What is lacking is only the substance that turned his routine into tragedy. Tonight we shall see how a rose can die twice, and perhaps discover whose hand guided its death." He ushered us inside. The conservatory was dim, its glass walls streaked with condensation, the air heavy with the mingled scents of damp earth and fading blooms. Upon the wicker chair lay the ledger and book as before. On the small bench rested the shriveled rose beneath its glass dome, a mute witness. Holmes lit a single lamp, its glow throwing long shadows among the orchids. "I propose an experiment," he continued. "We shall ignite a fumigation, as Sir Septimus did, but instead of sulphur cakes, I shall employ harmless charcoal. The conditions will be the same, the vents closed, the air still, and then we shall introduce our specimen, the second rose I cut today from the same plant. If it withers unnaturally, the explanation lies in vapours. If it endures, then we must look to other means. But I assure you, gentlemen, it will endure, for tonight no treachery will touch it." At this, Lionel laughed uneasily. "A conjurer's trick, Mr. Holmes. What do you hope to prove with flowers?" Holmes turned to him, eyes glinting. "I hope to prove nothing. I expect to reveal, and revelation often disquiets those who have most to conceal." Brack made a small movement as if to speak, then pressed his lips tight. Holmes placed the fresh rose in Sir Septimus's buttonhole, then settled into the wicker chair. "I shall play the part of the victim. he said lightly. "Watson, stand ready with your lantern. Lestrade, keep the door secured. And you, gentlemen, watch carefully. A man's life was taken in this room, silently and with cunning. Tonight we shall hear the echo of that silence." He struck a match, set the charcoal glowing faintly in the pan, and closed the vents with deliberate care. The air thickened at once. The scent of smoke mingled with the heavy perfume of orchids. We waited. Minutes passed, each stretched taut by expectation. The rose remained fresh, its white petals unmarked. Lionel shifted impatiently, muttering that the whole business was absurd. Brack's eyes, however, never left the pan. Holmes, feigning the posture of a man at ease, allowed the silence to deepen. Then he spoke suddenly, his voice sharp. "Mr. Brack, will you oblige us by examining the pan? You seem more concerned with it than with my safety." Brack started violently. I assure you." But Holmes was already on his feet, moving with the quickness of a striking hawk. He snatched the secretary's hand and held it to the light. A faint smear of dark powder stained the fingertips. Holmes lifted it for all to see. Charcoal leaves little trace, but sulphur and chloroform leave more. You could not resist ensuring my substitution was genuine. Your fingers betray you, sir. The room erupted at once, Lady Eugenia gasping, Lionel shouting in triumph, Lestrade stepping forward with an oath. Brack's composure crumbled. His face blanched to chalk. His lips trembled. "It was an accident," he cried suddenly, his voice breaking. "I only meant to quiet him to prove my worth. He mocked me, said I would never rise beyond a clerk. He would not grant me partnership, nor leave me his discoveries. I thought a scare, nothing more. A breath to weaken him, to make him dependent. But the vapour was stronger than I judged. He was dead before I knew it." Holmes released his wrist, his gaze merciless. "An accident you prepared with a chemist's hand and a murderer's calculation. You sealed the vent to prolong his exposure, then left the panel loose to cover your trail. You removed the cork from the chloroform phial and allowed suspicion to fall upon chance. And you left the rose, withered beyond nature, as your signature." Brack sank into a chair, covering his face with trembling hands. Lestrade clapped irons on him with grim efficiency, his earlier doubts swept away by the confession. Lionel, flushed and breathless, turned to Lady Eugenia with a look that mingled relief and self-satisfaction. She, however, seemed scarcely aware of him, her gaze fixed upon the shriveled bloom as though it alone held the truth of her husband's fate. Holmes closed the ledger and set it gently aside. "There, madam, is your answer. Your husband did not die of weakness but of treachery. The rose has spoken, and we have listened." We left the conservatory then, the fog pressing close as though eager to swallow the last echoes of Brack's broken words. Holmes walked with his usual composure, yet I sensed beneath it the flicker of satisfaction that came when a pattern had unfolded precisely as he had foreseen. For myself, I felt a curious awe, that something as fragile as a rose could expose a murderer where all other evidence faltered. Holmes must have read my thoughts, for as we turned into the lamplit street he said softly, "It is the small things, Watson, the trifles others overlook. A flower that dies twice may be more eloquent than a dozen witnesses. Remember that, and you will never despair of human reason." The fog had scarcely lifted when the morning papers blared with the news. Secretary arrested in veil mystery. The headlines, as usual, favoured sensation over accuracy, for Brack had not yet stood before a magistrate. Nevertheless, the story spread like wildfire through London drawing-rooms and clubs, and by mid-morning Baker Street saw a procession of curious callers. Reporters with notebooks poised, men from the horticultural societies whispering of rivalries, and even one gentleman from the Royal Institution who wished to know whether Holmes would present his findings in lecture form. Holmes dismissed them all with an air of weary tolerance, turning his attention instead to the stack of telegrams that accumulated upon our mantelpiece. "Observe, Watson," he said, spreading them before him. "Here are 5 inquiries regarding the so-called Alba Valensis Rose, 3 from breeders, 2 from men of finance. That Sir Septimus's secretary has been arrested excites not their pity, but their greed. They sent a prize unguarded. I could not conceal my dismay. You think, then, that the affair is not concluded? Brack confessed. Plainly, unequivocally." Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Plainly, yes. Unequivocally, no. A confession in the heat of exposure may satisfy the Yard, but not me. Consider, Watson, Brack claims accident, that he only meant to frighten his master. Yet every act, the sealed vent, the doctored fumigation, the careful substitution of corks, speaks of deliberation. Moreover, why tamper with the rose? Why leave so theatrical a token unless to direct attention elsewhere? I smell not only chloroform, but contrivance." His words unsettled me, for I had felt relief when the secretary's guilt seemed proved. But Holmes's doubts once uttered took root in my mind. If not Brack, then who? That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we must discover. Brack may be guilty, but of what degree? Perhaps of complicity, perhaps of ignorance exploited. The real hand may yet move behind the curtain. At that moment Lestrade was announced, looking both pleased and defensive. "We've lodged Brack in a cell," he reported. "The papers may crow, but the magistrate won't sit until tomorrow. Still, the case is as neat as a pin. You heard his confession yourself." Holmes regarded him with that expression of patient superiority which never failed to nettle the inspector. Confession, Lestrade, is the daughter of fear, not always of truth. "Tell me, did you search his rooms?" "Of course we did," said Lestrade with some indignation. "We found papers, ledgers, nothing damning. He lived as tidy as he kept his beard." "And in Lionel Vale's lodgings?" Holmes asked quietly. The inspector's brow furrowed. "We've had no cause to search there." Holmes rose abruptly. "Then we shall create a cause. Watson, fetch your coat. Lestrade, you may accompany us, or you may arrive later to collect the crumbs. But if you wish to know whether Brack is villain or victim, you will not let Lionel Vale's chambers remain untouched another hour." Within the half-hour, we were in Sloane Square, mounting a narrow stair to the cousins' lodgings. Lionel received us with ill-concealed irritation, though he made a show of civility. His rooms were cluttered with sketches, apparatus of a dubious scientific nature, and the unmistakable litter of an indolent man who fancies himself a genius. Holmes wandered the room with apparent aimlessness, fingering a coil of copper wire here, a pamphlet there, until his gaze fell upon a small cabinet by the window. With a swift motion he opened it. Inside lay a jumble of bottles and flasks, some labelled, others not. Holmes plucked one up, removed the stopper, and held it to my nose. I recoiled at once. "The same odour. Chloroform," Lionel flushed angrily. "What of it? I experiment. I seek to prove the stimulation of plant growth by electric current and chemical aid. Sir Septimus dismissed me as a charlatan. Am I to be condemned for pursuing science?" Holmes's eyes were like ice. "You are to be condemned, sir, for possessing the very agent that slew your cousin, and for concealing it when the matter was under inquiry." Lionel laughed harshly. "Proof? You have none," Brack confessed. "He said it himself." Holmes set down the bottle with exquisite care. "Yes," he confessed, "too readily. That is what troubled me. He is timid, deferential, easily cowed. A man of such disposition may bear guilt, But he does not contrive theatrical murders with roses and vapours. Someone else conceived the play. Someone who knew Brack's weaknesses, who could thrust responsibility upon him while profiting from Sir Septimus's death. Someone who coveted more than recognition, perhaps the fortune, perhaps the rose itself. Lionel's composure cracked. His hands clenched upon the back of a chair. "You cannot prove it," he hissed. Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, your cabinet proves enough for a magistrate. But there is more. Lady Eugenia has given me the key to Sir Septimus's private safe. Within it I discovered a codicil to his will, drafted but unsigned. It named you, Lionel, as sole heir to his botanical patents if you could demonstrate sound scientific achievement within the year. You killed him not merely for resentment, but for profit." Lestrade uttered a triumphant exclamation and stepped forward. But Lionel was quicker. With a sudden movement, he seized a flask from the cabinet and hurled it to the ground. The air filled at once with a cloying, suffocating sweetness. I staggered back, coughing, while Lionel dashed for the door. Holmes, however, had anticipated him. With a swift movement, he tripped the fleeing man, sending him sprawling. Lestrade pinned him with professional relish, snapping the irons upon his wrists. I flung open the window to clear the choking fumes, my heart pounding. Holmes stood calm amid the chaos, his gaze fixed upon Lionel as though studying a specimen. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "the rose was but a mask. The true poisoner was never Brack, but the cousin, whose vanity and greed dressed murder in the guise of horticultural accident. Brack's guilt was fear that his own hand had played some inadvertent part. But the true art lay here, in this room, among these bottles." Lionel cursed bitterly, but Lestrade only tightened his grip. "You've got him this time, Mr. Holmes. No paper in London can doubt it now." Holmes's expression softened slightly as he looked toward me. "Doubt, my dear Watson, is the beginning of wisdom. A confession may close a case for the Yard, but it must never close the mind of a detective. Only when every petal is examined do we see the whole rose and know which hand plucked it." Lionel Vale was conveyed to the Yard that night, protesting with furious eloquence that he had been framed, that Brack had contrived the entire performance, that Holmes had spun a web from trifles and caught an innocent man. His words rang hollow in the presence of the bottles, the residue upon the cabinet shelf, and the unmistakable vapour that still clung to his chambers. Lestrade, delighted with so dramatic an arrest, declared the matter closed, and London was quick to echo him. But Holmes, though outwardly serene, showed no signs of relinquishing his vigilance. He examined Lionel's cabinet once more before leaving, collecting a residue in a small glass vial, and carried it away with the careful gravity of a man who knows one last link remains to be forged. Back at Baker Street, long past midnight, Holmes set to work with his chemical apparatus, reducing the residue to a crystalline film upon a plate. He studied it beneath his lens, muttering to himself, while I drowsed in my chair. At length he spoke, his tone quiet but firm. "It is as I suspected, Watson. Chloroform alone could not have produced so swift and dramatic a decay in the rose. There is here a compound of sulphur and chlorine, prepared crudely, but with deadly effect." Lionel Vale had not the skill for such manipulation unaided. He possessed the motive, yes, but not the craft. I started upright. Then Brack. Holmes's eyes glimmered. Brack was no mere victim of circumstance. His hands bore the stains, his mind the knowledge. Lionel supplied the motive and the arrogance, Brack the skill and the opportunity. It was a partnership, however unequal, forged of resentment and ambition. Brack believed himself indispensable. Lionel believed himself destined. Each despised Sir Septimus in his own way, and together they contrived the experiment that ended in death. I felt a chill despite the fire, but Brack confessed alone. Because he thought confession would save Lionel, Holmes replied. Mark his timidity, his eagerness to assume blame, his panic at the suggestion of experiment. He believed his cousin by marriage too clever ever to be caught. When Lionel was arrested, Brack's silence cracked, but too late. He misjudged both Lionel's capacity for folly and mine for persistence. The following morning, Holmes insisted upon a final visit to Cheyne Walk. Lady Eugenia received us with a composure more fragile than it first appeared. Her hands trembled as she poured coffee, her eyes searching Holmes's face for assurance. He asked permission to examine Sir Septimus's safe once more, and she led us to the study. Within, Holmes drew out the codicil he had spoken of before and laid it upon the desk. "Observe, Watson," he said, pointing to the neat script. Sir Septimus intended to grant Lionel the patents only upon proof of true scientific achievement. This, more than inheritance, spurred Lionel's impatience. He wished the fruits without the labour. Brack, privy to all papers, knew of the codicil and whispered of it to him. Together they formed their desperate resolve. The one saw fortune, the other recognition. Both found infamy. Lady Eugenia bowed her head. "It is bitter comfort, Mr. Holmes, yet comfort still. My husband's good name will not be dimmed by whispers of weakness." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Madam, his name stands untarnished. He died not of feebleness but of treachery, which is a different matter altogether. And justice, though slow, is not blind." We took our leave soon after, the fog beginning to thin, and the pale spring sun showing itself once more above the river. In the cab, Holmes smoked in silence, his gaze distant. At last he said, "Do you note, Watson, how often the criminal overreaches when vanity is at stake? Lionel might have inherited wealth and station in time, but the desire to prove himself greater than his cousin consumed him. Brack might have risen to respect as a diligent secretary, but envy whispered that he was unappreciated, so each lent the other what he lacked, ambition and ability. Such alliances are rarely lasting, and never without ruin." By the time we reached Baker Street, Lestrade awaited us, flushed with the triumph of his latest report to the Yard. "Both men will stand before the magistrate," he announced. "Brack will not escape with his tongue tied in knots. Not now Lionel has implicated him, and Lionel's bottles will hang him neatly. It's as clean a case as I've had in years, Mr. Holmes." Holmes gave one of his thin smiles. "It is cleaner now than it was last night, Lestrade. You may thank the rose for that. Without its double death, neither man's guilt would have been revealed. The flower that withered too swiftly told us what no witness could." Lestrade sniffed, half amused, half disdainful. "A rose, then, solves what baffled the Yard. Well, I'll give you your due, but I'll not be telling the lads at headquarters it was a petal that cracked the case." Holmes chuckled softly and drew upon his pipe. "Say instead, Lestrade, that reason and patience solved it. If men choose to call reason by another name, that is their affair." That evening, as the lamps were lit, and the last edition of the day's paper arrived with its lurid engraving of the conservatory, I found Holmes at the window, watching the city's glow through the fog. He spoke almost to himself. "It is curious, Watson, how men contrive their own ruin. Sir Septimus lived by method. His killers perished by a parody of it. They thought themselves clever enough to master vapours and conceal intent, yet they forgot that trifles, dust on a wrist, a flower's untimely decay, speak louder than grand contrivances. It is always so. One cannot silence truth, only delay its voice." I wrote his words in my notebook, sensing that they held the essence of the case. For my part, I could not walk past a rose thereafter without recalling the strange spectacle of a bloom that had died twice, and the brilliance of my friend who had read its language as plainly as a man might read a printed page. The proceedings that followed were swift by London standards, for the evidence against both Brack and Lionel Vale was too substantial to ignore. Newspapers continued to embroider the tale with lurid phrases: the poison rose mystery, the death in the conservatory. But behind the clamour, the machinery of justice ground steadily forward. Lionel, once so cocksure, grew gaunt and desperate, railing at his cousin's memory from the dock and damning Brack as a Judas. Brack, pale and defeated, shrank visibly each day, his once practised neatness now a pitiful habit. Their alliance had dissolved into mutual recrimination, yet both were caught in the same net. I accompanied Holmes to the preliminary hearing, more for my own curiosity than from any obligation, for Holmes rarely permitted me to play any role in the dry formalities of law. As I sat beside him in the crowded gallery, I could not help but marvel at the composure with which he observed the two men. He regarded them less as prisoners than as specimens under glass, each movement or inflection catalogued in the laboratory of his mind. When Brack faltered in his voice, Holmes noted it with a flicker of interest. When Lionel's bravado erupted in a bitter outburst, he made a small annotation in his pocket-book. As we departed the court, I asked him whether he felt satisfaction now that the case had reached its conclusion. He gave a dry laugh. "Satisfaction, Watson? I confess to a species of intellectual gratification. But satisfaction is denied me whenever a man of talent, however twisted, chooses the crooked path. Brack had skill enough to rise by honest means, yet his vanity craved recognition without risk. Lionel had fortune enough to bide his time, yet his pride demanded immediate triumph. Both are examples of the most dangerous arrogance. That which believes nature herself may be compelled to applaud." We returned to Baker Street, and I thought the matter closed. Yet late that evening, as I was preparing to leave Holmes to his chemical pursuits, a letter arrived, delivered by hand. The envelope was plain, the seal already broken. Inside, in a trembling script, were a few lines signed by Lady Eugenia. She begged Holmes to call upon her once more. She had discovered something in her husband's private conservatory that troubled her greatly, and dared not entrust it to anyone but him. Holmes read it twice, his brows knitting. "Curious," he murmured. "She speaks of discovery, but not of what she has found. There is hesitation in her phrasing, a reluctance to write plainly. Watson, we shall oblige her at once." Though the hour was late, we drove again to Cheyne Walk. The house seemed lonelier than before, the blinds drawn and the faintest glimmer of lamplight spilling from the conservatory. Lady Eugenia met us at the door, her expression grave. Without a word, she led us down the passage to the room where her husband had perished. She pointed to a small drawer built into the base of the bench where Sir Septimus had kept his gardening tools. "This was locked, Mr. Holmes. I had not the key, but the carpenter opened it for me today. Within I found these." She handed him a bundle of papers, tied with string. Holmes opened them at once, scanning the contents under the lamp. His face grew intent. "Watson, do you perceive? These are notes not of horticulture, but of chemistry." Sir Septimus was experimenting with compounds. Sulphurous fumes combined with volatile agents, carefully measured, their effects upon plant tissue recorded. Here even is a calculation of dosage sufficient to cause faintness in small animals. Lady Eugenia clasped her hands. "Does this mean my husband was complicit in his own death? That he brought it upon himself?" Holmes shook his head gravely. "No, madam. These are the notes of a scientist probing the border between safety and peril. He trod close to the line but did not cross it. His discipline lay in recording, not in application upon himself. What is more telling is that Brack, privy to these papers, had in them the very knowledge required to twist experiment into murder. He did not invent the method, he borrowed it. That is why the crime bore the mark of both boldness and blunder. Bold in conception, blunder in execution. The revelation struck me with sudden force. Then the Rose's death was anticipated, but as a specimen in research, not as an accomplice in murder. Precisely, Watson. Sir Septimus observed the accelerated decay of petals exposed to certain vapours. He would have perfected his results, given time, but Brack seized upon them, guided Lionel's resentment, and together they transformed research into weapon. The irony is bitter indeed, that a man's curiosity should provide the means of his undoing. Lady Eugenia's eyes glistened. I feared as much, yet I am grateful you have clarified it. Better the world know him as a man of science, undone by treachery, than as a careless fool who perished by his own hand. Holmes bowed slightly. Your husband's reputation shall stand untarnished. I shall see to it that these papers are safeguarded. They belong not in idle hands, but in the custody of those who understand their danger. We left her calmer, though the conservatory, dimly lit and filled with the scent of damp soil, still seemed to whisper of secrets best left undisturbed. As our cab rattled back toward Baker Street, Holmes sat in silence, the bundle of papers upon his knee. At last he spoke, his tone reflective. You see, Watson, how narrow the margin between knowledge and peril. Sir Septimus sought only to advance science. Brack sought recognition. Lionel sought fortune. Each pursued what he desired, yet only one did so without malice. The others converted curiosity into crime, and thus we arrive at a conclusion I have drawn before, that science is but a tool, its virtue or vice dependent entirely upon the hand that wields it. I made some remark upon the justice of the law that would soon dispose of the guilty men. Holmes smiled faintly through the smoke of his pipe. Justice, yes, but never forget, Watson, that truth is often subtler than verdicts. The rose that died twice shall live long in memory, not merely as a curiosity of botany, but as a lesson in human folly, and perhaps, too, as a reminder that even the most fragile bloom may carry within it the power to reveal murder most foul. His words lingered with me as I set down my pen that night, for I realized that the case was not merely one of crime and detection, but of knowledge misapplied, of ambition turned sour, and of a flower whose untimely death spoke louder than any witness in the crowded courts of London. Courts of London. Courts. The trial of Lionel Vale and Amos Brack drew wide attention, for the details of the so-called Poison Rose mystery held a fascination too peculiar to be ignored. Day after day the court was crowded, the benches lined with curious gentlemen of science and society ladies eager for sensation. Holmes and I attended only when summoned, for though he had provided the keystone of evidence, he disliked the theatre of justice when the drama was no longer intellectual. Yet the case moved forward with the inexorable pace of law. The bottles from Lionel's lodgings, the stains upon Brack's fingers, the ledger with its fatal entries, and above all, the testimony of the shrivelled rose, preserved under glass like a relic of crime. Lionel's defence rested upon bluster. He claimed the chemicals were for innocent experiments, that Brack alone bore guilt, that Holmes had tricked him into seeming panic. His words rang hollow, for witnesses testified to his quarrels with Sir Septimus, his repeated demands for money, and his arrogance in boasting of discoveries that were never his. Brack, for his part, attempted humility. He insisted that his confession had been wrung from him in confusion. that he had been the unwilling servant of Lionel's schemes. Yet, under Holmes's precise cross-examination, his contradictions multiplied until even the magistrates grew impatient. The partnership of convenience that had plotted death collapsed entirely beneath the weight of evidence, each man eager to see the other fall. On the final day, Holmes was called to speak. He did so with the calm brevity that distinguished him from all other witnesses. He described the conservatory, the ledger, the pan, the withering of the rose. He explained how sulphur alone could not have produced the effect, how chloroform adulterated the vapours, how the sealing of the vents betrayed forethought, and then he concluded with words that silenced the court. Gentlemen, it is often the trifles that speak most clearly. A flower, fresh at 9 o'clock, withered by midnight, told us more than any man's protestations. The rose died twice, and in its death it accused the living. The verdict was as inevitable as the dawn. Lionel Vale, the architect of the scheme, was condemned to death. Brack, judged an accomplice rather than the instigator, was sentenced to penal servitude for life. Lady Eugenia received the outcome with composure that surprised me. When I conveyed Holmes's assurances that her husband's name remained unblemished, she pressed my hand in gratitude and declared she would preserve his conservatory as he left it, a memorial to his pursuits. When the clamour of the case subsided, and Baker Street once more settled into its accustomed routine, I found Holmes reflective rather than triumphant. For several evenings he sat silent by the fire, the blue smoke of his pipe wreathing about him like the fog of the Thames, his gaze fixed upon the coals. At last one night he spoke. "Watson, do you know why I find this case lingering in my thoughts?" I ventured that it was the unusual nature of the evidence, the strangeness of a rose serving as witness to murder. "Not so," he replied softly. "It is because the crime was, in essence, the corruption of knowledge. Sir Septimus sought truth in the behaviour of plants. Yet those who envied him twisted his discoveries into tools of death. I have seen men kill for gold, for passion, for revenge. But here the weapon was science itself, distorted by vanity. It is a warning, Watson. The age presses forward with inventions and discoveries, but the moral sense of man does not always keep pace." His words struck me deeply, for I too had marvelled at the ingenuity of the method, even while recoiling from its cruelty. I said as much, and he gave me one of his rare quick smiles. "Precisely. Admiration and abhorrence. Such are the twin faces of progress. But enough of philosophy. The case is closed, and the world spins on. Already the Yard clamours for my attention upon a burglary in Bayswater. Let us turn our minds to fresher puzzles." Yet even as he dismissed it, I could not. The vision of the conservatory lingered with me. The wicker chair, the ledger abandoned mid-line, the rose that withered too swiftly. It seemed to embody the fragility of life itself, and the ease with which envy could blight what patience had cultivated. Some weeks later, on a clear spring morning, I passed Cheyne Walk and saw Lady Eugenia walking alone among the glass-housed plants. She paused before the bed of roses, and I fancied I saw her touch one bloom gently, as if in remembrance. She looked up and met my gaze, and though she did not speak, her nod conveyed both sorrow and peace. I walked on, reflecting that justice had been served, yet no verdict could restore what had been lost. When I returned to Baker Street, I found Holmes bent over his chemical bench, absorbed in some new experiment. He looked up briefly and said, "Ah, Watson, did you observe the sky over the river? A fine clarity today, after so much fog. It puts one in mind that even after the darkest vapours, the air clears at last." I realized then that, in his own oblique fashion, he too had sought closure. The case of the rose that died twice had been solved, its culprits unmasked, its lesson etched upon our minds. Yet Holmes, ever the seeker, had already turned to the next mystery, content to leave this one behind with a final remark. And so it was that the affair of Sir Septimus Vale passed into memory, another chapter in the annals of my friend's extraordinary career. To the world it remained a curiosity, a sensational trial, a tale to fill the columns of the press. But to me it stood as something more, a reminder that even the smallest, most delicate thing, a single rose petal, may hold within it the power to reveal the darkest truths of human ambition. It was several weeks after the trial that Holmes and I found ourselves once more before the hearth at Baker Street, the fog of London rolling thick against the window panes. The city, ever eager for novelty, had moved on to fresher scandals, and the Vale affair was fading into the background of memory. Yet for me it lingered, as certain cases always did, less for the spectacle of crime than for the quiet sorrow it left in its wake. Holmes, who had spent the afternoon with his violin, set the instrument aside and leaned back, fingers steepled. "You are still brooding on the rose, Watson," he observed, his tone half amused, half sympathetic. "Your pen will no doubt give it a more poetic memorial than my science could provide." I confessed it was so. It struck me deeply, Holmes, that such a fragile thing should hold the key to life and death. A single bloom told us more than all the witnesses combined. He smiled faintly. "That is often the way of it. Trifles, overlooked by common eyes, cry out to the trained observer. It was not the strength of our case that condemned Lionel Vale and Amos Brack, but their own inability to imagine that nature itself would speak against them. They calculated with fumes and figures, but they forgot that truth clings to the smallest fibres of existence. A petal, Watson, may prove more damning than a pistol." His words stirred in me a sense of admiration I had felt countless times before, that mixture of awe and loyalty which his genius commanded. Yet there was also melancholy, for I knew how many more such cases lay ahead, each a testament not only to Holmes's brilliance, but to man's folly. "And yet," I said quietly, "it was envy and vanity that killed Sir Septimus, not the vapours. His killers clothed their malice in the garb of science." Holmes regarded me steadily. "True, tools themselves are innocent. It is the hand that wields them that decides their morality. Sir Septimus sought knowledge, Brack recognition, Lionel fortune. Of the three, only the first pursued his aim without malice. And so the rose he tended became, in death, his accuser and his vindication." We fell silent then, listening to the crackle of the fire. Outside, the bells of St. Marylebone tolled the hour, muffled by the fog. At length Holmes rose, stretching his long limbs with deliberate ease. "Come, Watson. The Yard will no doubt be clamouring soon over some more pedestrian matter. A stolen jewel or a bank fraud. It is as well. One cannot live always among poisons and withering roses. The world, fortunately, abounds in fresher puzzles." He reached for his pipe, then paused with a rare smile. "But you, my dear fellow, may set down the tale as you please. Only see that you do not make too much of me. The rose was the true detective in this case. I merely interpreted its language. And so I have written it, faithful to the facts, though no words of mine can capture the strange mingling of beauty and horror that hung over that conservatory in Cheyne Walk. To the public it remains the case of the rose that died twice. To so me it is a reminder that even the smallest, most delicate evidence, if rightly read, may expose the darkest ambitions of men. And as long as Sherlock Holmes lives to interpret those signs, I shall count myself fortunate to stand witness to his extraordinary gift. ordinary gift, ordinary